Hello, you can hear me. Hi. Thank you for coming. I'm Adam Becker. I'm in the Religious Studies program and the Classics department. You are at the this year's Lerner lecture. We call this the Lerner Workshop in Religion and Society at NYU, and I want to read you the description of that we keep it online, but the description of the event so so you can understand the context of this lecture, how we see this series running. The generous contribution of the Lerner family has allowed the Religious Studies program to create the Lerner Workshop in Religion and Society. Each year, a renowned scholar is invited to NYU for a distinguished lecture and seminar. Speakers will address issues that correspond with the program's ongoing mission to explore religious practice and belief as integral parts of human social life. As the program faculty's intellectual interests, as well as its close working relationship with the Center for Religion and Media and the joint MA degree with the Department of Journalism attest, a central part of our intellectual and institutional project is to create public contexts for the kind of conversations about religion and social life that usually only occur in the academy. Just as religion is something fundamentally public, even when privatized, so the conversation about it should be as well. As our wide interdisciplinary approach includes anthropological and historical, literary, and philosophical approaches to the study of religion, so the invited speaker is asked to think big about the given topic. And this is our third Lerner lecture. The first one 2 years ago was given by Diane Winston where she's at USC, on religion, sexuality, and AIDS, all the news that's fit to print. And last year's lecture was given by Jeffrey Stout, someone actually whom Professor Cavanaugh has responded to in his own work. Jeffrey Stout's lecture was Shadow of a Doubt, Hitchcock on Augustine, Freud, and Horrendous Evil. I don't think I told you that Jeff Stout was your predecessor in this. I didn't mean to, before introducing the speaker, I need to thank several people. First, I should thank the Lerner family, whose generous gift has given the Religious Studies program an endowment by which we can pay for these lectures. And the Lerner family, one of their children, Jonathan, was one of our students several years ago. And it was actually really an honor to our program that his enthusiasm for our major and for the study of religion led to them giving us this gift. I also have to thank the Dean of the College of Arts and Science, Gabby Starr, who's a co-sponsor of this event. I have to thank the Center for Religion and Media, and as well as the Center for Spiritual Life for helping to promote the event. Most of all, I have to thank Janine Paolucci for doing everything, aside from getting on a plane and coming here and giving a lecture, which that's something I should also thank Professor Cavanaugh for. But Janine has done all of the organization and in general is a wonderful colleague and administrator, and responds to weird I like it's strange because I send emails at strange times and I get answers at even stranger times. So I thank her. So afterwards we're going to have some questions, and then further we'll have a reception and everyone is invited to. Professor William T. Cavanaugh is a professor of Catholic Studies at DePaul University. He has various honors, numerous publications, books, articles, reviews, 2 edited volumes on political theology. I'm going to be characterizing your work, so you can correct me. Professor Cavanaugh is a Catholic theologian, but Catholic in, I think, several senses of the term Catholic. First, he engages with the Catholic tradition. Second, he engages more broadly with the Christian tradition, so in the Catholic in the lowercase c in a broader sense, and in both of these cases he's engaged often with ecclesiology, that is the nature of the church, the role of the church, but he's also a Catholic theologian in another sense, that is, he often writes as a Christian addressing larger universal problems as well as the problem of the universal itself. In his work he engages in different issues. For example, he looks at addresses pluralism's limitations, and how it can be rendered into a more radical pluralism. He questions how Christians can be Christian without being Constantinian. And by that I mean how Christians can be Christian without nostalgically longing for the triumphal Christendom that Christian thinkers as early as Augustine were anxious about or worried about. He has written a lot on torture and thought a lot about torture. His book, which was originally his dissertation book from 1998, Torture and Eucharist, Theology, Politics, and the Body of Christ, looks at Eucharistic practice as a response to the torture practiced by the Pinochet regime in Chile. His volume, Being Consumed, from 2008, Being Consumed, Economics and Christian Desire, looks at consumer culture, globalization, the free market, and its unfreedoms. Much of Professor Cavanaugh's work undertakes, to quote from the introduction of Torture and Eucharist, quote, it undertakes to search for the church as the true body of Christ, capable of enacting a counter-practice to that of the state. For myself, as a non-Christian who doesn't read certain texts as a Christian, the Christian perspective that Professor Cavanaugh's work offers helps to parochialize the present. It helps me in thinking to step outside of the norms of liberalism, nationalism, and secularism, and to think about their various presuppositions, but through the tools of the Christian tradition. So I think it's worth bringing up that I think for many people in the academy, because the academy is so secular, we say someone's a Christian theologian, and it becomes like, oh, it's theology. Right, but this is theology that's really engaged with many of our issues that are beyond the Christian tradition and outside of religion for many people. In a way, Professor Cavanaugh is also a theologian in another sense. And I think we'll see this in tonight's lecture. Although I think his project in the myth of religious violence is also a historical, synthetic project. I think he's also, in a way, his work is a descriptive theologian of the nation state, that other community which people are willing to die for. It's not just religion that people die for. His work lays out the nation state's soteriology, its rituals, and its beliefs. And yet, despite the certain functional equivalencies that he'll point out, the transfer of the holy from the church to the state and the public devotion to the state, for him, is not religion. And he draws a certain boundary. And you can see this in my graduate seminar this week, read his 2011 book, Migrations of the Holy, God, State, and the Political Meaning of the Church. And there he treats the adoration of the nation state as something actually that older than religion in our sense, of the modern sense of the term. It's older in as much as the nation state is really ultimately a form of idolatry in his work. So please join me in welcoming Professor Cavanaugh as he talks to us about the myth of religious violence. I don't want to steal your lecture.
Thanks, Adam, for that kind introduction and for the great tour of the neighborhood that you just gave me. We just spent the last couple hours walking around one of the great places in the world, West Village, so it was it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Janine Paolucci for doing all the work again, and thanks to Angela and everybody else here at the Department of Religious Studies for the invitation. I have a couple friends in the audience as well, my nephew Tom Storch and Ian Barnes, that I haven't seen since he had me come to Perth, Australia a few years ago. He said that he found this lecture by looking it up on Free Things to Do or something, and so I promised him to give him his money's worth. It's going to be worth every penny. So I was out for a walk not too long ago, and I came upon a very distraught man who was looked like he was ready to throw himself off a bridge. And I said to him, "Wait, there's so much to to live for? Do you believe in God? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, so do I. Me too. Are you a Christian or a Jew? And he said, I'm a Christian. And I said, me too. Are you a Catholic or a Protestant? And he said, I'm a Protestant. And I said, me too. What kind? And he said, I'm a Baptist. And I said, me too. Southern Baptist or Northern Baptist? And he said, Northern Baptist. And I said, me too. Northern Conservative Baptist or Northern Liberal Baptist? And he said, Northern Conservative Baptist. And I said, me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Baptist New England region? And he said, Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region. And I said, me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1879 or Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912? And he said, Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912. And I said, die, heretic! And I pushed him off the bridge. That joke by Emo Phillips was recently voted the funniest religion joke in an online poll. And I think the fact that it was voted the funniest religion joke tells you something about the way people think about religion, right? That it has this inherent tendency towards violence and division and so on. I gave a lecture a while ago at a college in New York, and the lecture was called, Does Religion Cause Violence? And as I was making my way to the lecture hall to give the lecture, I saw a poster advertising the talk, and someone had scrawled the word duh over the poster, and I thought, yeah, that pretty much kind of sums it up. It's just part of the kind of folklore of American or Western society that religion has this tendency to cause violence. It underlies a lot of our institutions and policies, from limits on the role of churches in the domestic scene to policy in the Middle East and so on. So tonight I'm going to challenge that conventional wisdom, not though in the way that you may have heard it challenged before. Some people will argue that the real motivation behind so-called religious violence is not really religious, it's really political or economic or something like that. Other people argue that people who do violence are by definition not religious. The crusader is not really Christian because he hasn't, understood the Christian message and so on. I don't think either of those arguments works in the first place because I don't think that you can separate out politics from religion in such an easy way, and I'm going to talk about that more. It's hard, for example, to separate religion from politics in Islam. A lot of Muslims don't make any such separation. In the second case, it may be true that the crusader has misappropriated the Christian message, but you can't thereby excuse Christianity of complicity in the violence. Christianity is not just a set of doctrines, it's a set of lived experiences and institutions. So I have no intention of excusing Christianity, Islam, any other faith tradition from careful analysis. Given certain conditions, they can and do contribute to violence. But what's implied in the conventional wisdom is that Christianity, Islam, and other faiths are more inclined toward violence than ideologies and institutions that are identified as secular. So in order for the indictment of religion to hold, religion must be contrasted with something else that's inherently less prone to violence, the secular. And it's that story that I want to challenge tonight. And so I'm going to argue, in the first place, there's no good reason for thinking that religious ideologies and institutions are more inherently prone to violence than so-called secular ideologies and institutions. And this is so because there is no essential difference between religious and secular to begin with. So let me be clear again that I don't deny at all that Christians and Muslims and others can and do use their faith to justify violence. What I deny is that such violence is of an essentially different and inherently more troublesome nature than violence done in the name of supposedly more mundane and secular realities like kings and nations and flags and freedom and oil and so on. Religious and secular are invented categories. They're not just the way things are. So I'm going to look at the political reasons why these categories were invented in the modern West, and then show that the idea that there's something called religion that's essentially prone to violence is an ideological justification that is used to justify the violence of so-called secular orders. So the myth of religious violence promotes a dichotomy between us in the secular West who are rational and peacemaking, and them over there, usually meaning the hordes of crazy Muslims over there. Their violence is religious and therefore irrational and divisive. Our violence, on the other hand, is secular and rational and peacemaking, and therefore we find ourselves regrettably forced to bomb them into the higher rationality. That's a joke. Sorry. So, to start with, the incoherence of the argument. I'm going to start with one of the most famous atheists today, the late Christopher Hitchens. His best-selling book, God is Not Great, is subtitled with typical British understatement, How Religion Poisons Everything. There he points to histories of abuses by Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Confucianists, and so on, but he also faces up to the fact that atheist regimes, such as those of Joseph Stalin and Kim Jong-il, are responsible for tens of millions of deaths and uncounted suffering. Hitchens deals with this little problem by declaring that atheist regimes like Stalin's are religious too. He says totalitarianism aims at human perfection, which is essentially a religious impulse, and so religion poisons everything because everything poisonous gets identified as religion. At the same time, everything good ends up on the other side of the religious-secular divide. Here's what Hitchens says of Martin Luther King. In no real as opposed to nominal sense, then, was he a Christian. And he bases this remarkable conclusion on the notion that King was nonviolent while the Bible preaches violence from cover to cover. So what's not violent cannot possibly be religious because religion is defined as violent. Now, at this point, we could just sort of dismiss Hitchens and assume that Stalin is not really religious and start arguing over who has caused more deaths in the 20th centuries, atheists or those who believe in God. But that would be to assume that we know what religion is and what religion isn't. Hitchens is useful because he shows that what counts as religion and what doesn't count as religion is a fluid matter that often depends on the political agenda that one is pursuing. Hitchens is by no means alone in this. If you examine arguments that religion causes violence, you find that what counts as religion and what doesn't is largely incoherent. In the first chapter of my book, I go through 9 different arguments from all different fields, showing the inability, the division between what's religious and what's secular is a moving target. Let me give you a few examples. Martin Marty, one of the preeminent historians of religion in the U.S. today, in a book on public religion, Marty argues that religion has a particular tendency to be divisive and therefore violent. But Marty then gives 17 different definitions of religion, and then he says, look, we'll never come up with a definition of religion. So instead, he says, I'm going to give you 5 features that mark a religion. And then he goes and shows how politics fits all 5 of the same features. So religion focuses our ultimate concern, and so does politics. Religion builds community, so does politics. Religion appeals to myth and symbol, and politics mimics this appeal in devotion to the flag, war memorials, and so on down the list. So Marty offers 5 defining features of religion and shows how politics fits all 5. He's trying to show how closely intertwined religion and politics are, but he ends up demolishing any theoretical basis for separating the two. Another example, sociologist Mark Juergensmeyer, whose book Terror in the Mind of God is perhaps the most widely influential academic book on religion and violence. It's in its 3rd edition now. According to Juergensmeyer, religion exacerbates the tendency to divide people into friends and enemies, good and evil, us and them, by ratcheting divisions up to a cosmic level. But he's forced to admit the difficulty of separating religious violence from secular violence. So he writes, secular nationalism, like religion, embraces what one scholar calls a doctrine of destiny. One can take this way of looking at secular nationalism a step further and state flatly that secular nationalism is a religion. And elsewhere, he says, the secular is a sort of advanced form of religion. Now, these are important concessions, but if they're true, they subvert the entire basis of his argument, which is the sharp divide between religious and secular violence. Now, for some religion and violence theorists, the confusion around the religious-secular divide is resolved in a functionalist way by just openly expanding the category of religion to include ideologies and practices that are usually called secular. So in his book, Why People Do Bad Things in the Name of Religion, Richard Wentz blames violence on absolutism, and religion, he says, has a peculiar tendency towards absolutism. But he casts a very wide net when he talks about religion. Here are some of the things that he counts as religion: faith in technology, secular humanism, consumerism, football fanaticism. He has this scene where he describes this guy watching this kind of non-church-going auto mechanic watching Monday Night Football and arranging his sandwiches and beer just so and letting his belly pop open as fly and so on. And he describes this whole scene in Eucharistic overtones. So all of these things count for Wentz as religion, and then he's compelled to conclude perhaps all of us do bad things in the name of religion. Now, I think he should be commended for his consistency in not trying to erect an artificial distinction between religious and secular types of absolutism, but the price of consistency, though, is that he evacuates his own argument of any explanatory force or usefulness. The word religion in the title of his book, Why People Do Bad Things in the Name of Religion, ends up meaning anything people do that gives their lives order and meaning. So a more economical title for the book just would have been Why People Do Bad Things, right? Because the term religion doesn't really serve any analytical purpose. So this is just a little taste of something that I do ad nauseum in the first couple chapters of my book. Wentz, Hitchens, Juergensmeyer, others, they're not necessarily wrong to include secular things, so-called secular things, in the category of religion. There's a vast literature on Marxism as a religion, for example. So, and I give example after example of Marxism being treated as a religion. Here's a couple of images that I thought were kind of similar. This is Our Lady of Mount Carmel and Joe Stalin. I just like doing that, sorry. There's an extensive body of scholarship as well that explores the prevalence of civil religion in the United States, which, as Robert Bellah says, has its own seriousness and integrity and requires the same care and understanding that any other religion does. Carolyn Marvin similarly argues, quote, nationalism is the most powerful religion in the United States, and perhaps in many other countries. Nationalism is the most powerful religion in the United States and perhaps in many other countries. That's Carolyn Marvin. Scholars have explored the peculiar, her book, Blood, Sacrifice, and the Nation, by the way, is an extraordinary book. Scholars have explored the peculiar myths and symbols and sacrifices that surround the flag. This is actually the image, it was on one of the posters for this talk. This is the image that I wanted Oxford University Press to put on the front cover of the book. But they thought it might be a little incendiary, so they they chose a different issue and a different picture, and the picture that they chose, I think, is a fine one, but it doesn't quite have the arresting nature of this. Until this is the way that American school children were taught to salute the American flag, until Hitler made this gesture unpopular in the 1930s, and then it got changed to hand over heart. There's all kinds of similar sorts of pictures. Sorry, just couldn't resist. You miss him. Come on, don't you? More images of American civil religion. This is, if you go into the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. and look up into the dome, this is the painting that you'll see the apotheosis of Washington, the becoming God of Washington, where Washington is being swept up into the heavens, surrounded by these kind of mythological figures. Not limited to political things, economic things as well. In the wake of rolling blackouts in California in 2001, after they deregulated the electricity industry out there, if you remember that, one of the architects of the deregulation was quoted in the New York Times expressing his belief that free markets always work better than state control. He said, "I believe in that premise as a matter of religious faith." Right? And scholars who take a Durkheimian functionalist approach will just take him at his word. Right? Yeah, it is a religion for him. A survey of religious studies literature finds the following treated under the rubric religion: totems, witchcraft, human rights, Marxism, liberalism, Freudianism, Japanese tea ceremonies, nationalism, sports fanaticism, free market ideology, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the list goes on and on. Alcoholics Anonymous was actually designated a religion by a federal appeals court judge in 2002. Now, I can imagine that there's an objection forming in your minds, and if it's not there, let me put it there. An objection that goes, look, religion, we all know, is really about belief in God or gods, right? But if that's the case, then you would have to eliminate certain belief systems that are usually called religions from the list, such as Taoism and Confucianism and many forms of Buddhism, which don't have a central concept of God or gods. So, okay, let's say we want to include those things. You want to include all forms of Buddhism into religion. So you use a term like transcendence instead of God, right? Some more inclusive term, so that you can expand the categories so things like Buddhism fall. Now, the problem is once you expand the categories, so other things, so that Buddhism is included, all sorts of other things get included as well. Many institutions and ideologies that don't explicitly refer to God or gods function in the same way as those that do. So expanding the concept of religion to include godless Buddhism makes it difficult to exclude godless Marxism. Likewise, it's hard to imagine a better candidate for transcendence than nationalism. The term transcendence is a tool of Western scholars of religion, who borrowed the term from the Judeo-Christian tradition, which with its distinction between a creator God and a created order. To apply this term to Buddhism, which has no such distinction, though, one needs to define transcendence in an exceedingly vague manner. But the vaguer the term becomes, the less justification one has for excluding other systems of belief and practice, such as nationalism. If terms like transcendence, the sacred, the super-empirical, and so on, are made vague enough to be transcultural, then the exclusivity of the term religion breaks down very quickly, and it all becomes very difficult to tell the difference between what's religious and what's secular. This is particularly relevant to the question of violence. Is there any good reason to suppose that people are more likely to kill for a god than for a nation? That's the question I want to ask. Is there any good reason to suppose that people are more likely to kill for a god than for a nation? Supposing we want to answer that question then in an empirical way. So ask these two questions. What percentage of Americans who identify themselves as Christians would be willing to kill for their Christian faith? And then ask what percentage would be willing to kill for their country? It seems clear to me that, at least among American Christians, the nation-state is subject to far more absolutist fervor than Christianity. For the majority of American Christians, really, even public evangelization is considered to be in poor taste, and yet most would endorse the organized slaughter on behalf of the nation as sometimes necessary and often laudable. We have to conclude, I think, that there is no coherent way to isolate religious ideologies with a peculiar tendency toward violence from their tamer secular counterparts. So-called secular ideologies and institutions like nationalism and capitalism can inspire just as much violence as so-called religion. The problem with Hitchens, then, is not that he thinks that Stalinism is a religion. The problem is that if he's going to use this expanded category of religion, he should do so consistently, but he doesn't. For Hitchens, American civil religion is not religion. Stalinism is, but American civil religion is not. That's purely secular. So really, the secular religious distinction is nothing more than the distinction between things Hitchens likes and things Hitchens doesn't like. And that's the way it tends to work in a lot of these, a lot of the literature. Now, another objection that might be percolating in your minds, right? Okay, sure, religion is a fuzzy concept, but all concepts are fuzzy, politics, culture, right? We use those terms even though they have fuzzy edges. That's not what I'm arguing, though. I'm not arguing that the problem is that religion has fuzzy edges. The problem is just the opposite. The implicit definitions of religion in these religion and violence arguments are unjustifiably clear about what does and doesn't qualify as a religion. And so certain belief systems like Islam get condemned, while others like nationalism are ignored. So my point here is not to argue either for or against an expansive definition of religion, a functionalist definition of religion. I have no intention of trying to solve once and for all the debate between functionalists and substantivists as to whether or not Confucianism is a religion, or Marxism is a religion, or free market capitalism is a religion. I don't think there is a once and for all definition of religion. That's the point. My point is that religion is a category that's constructed in different ways, in different times, in different places, and according to the interests of who is doing the construction. And to understand why that is, I'm going to move to the second part of what I'm going to do tonight, to look at the history of the term religion and the history of the religious-secular divide. Charles Kimball's book, When Religion Becomes Evil, begins with the following claim. It is somewhat trite, but nevertheless sadly true, to say that more wars have been waged, more people killed, and these days more evil perpetrated in the name of religion than by any other institutional force in human history. Now, Kimball apparently considers this claim too trite to need proving because he makes no attempt to reinforce it with evidence. But if you were to try to prove this, you would need a transhistorical and transcultural definition of religion that would be at least theoretically separable from other institutional forces over the course of human history. So political institutions, for example. The problem is that there was no religion as considered as something as separable from politics until the modern era, and then primarily in the West. The Romans had the term religio, that's where we get our term from. But there was no religion-politics distinction in the way that we consider it. How could there be when Caesar was considered a god? Likewise, if you were to ask, are the Aztecs' bloody sacrifices because of their religion or because of their politics? Right? Well, it's just, those distinctions just don't make any sense in Aztec society. Wilfred Cantwell Smith's landmark book in 1962, The Meaning and the End of Religion, he shows that religion as a discrete category of human activity, separable from politics, culture, etc., is an invention of the modern West. In the course of a detailed historical study of the concept religion, Smith concluded that in pre-modern Europe there was no significant concept equivalent to what we think of as religion. So the ancient Romans again had this concept religio, but it covered all kinds of civic duties and relations of respect that we would consider to be secular. So this is what Augustine says in the beginning of the 5th century. We have no right to affirm with confidence that religio is confined to the worship of God, since it seems that this word has been detached from its normal meaning, in which it refers to an attitude of respect in relations between a man and his neighbor. That's clearly not what we think is meant by religion. In the medieval era, the religious-secular distinction was used to distinguish clergy who belonged to an order from diocesan clergy. So the religious-secular distinction in the medieval era is the distinction between two different kinds of priests. Right? Catholics still talk about joining a religious order as joining the religious life. It's not as if you weren't religious before. But it's meant to distinguish those two different kinds. So in 1400, the religions of England were the various orders, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Benedictines. There was no realm of secular pursuits to which God was indifferent, and although there was a distinction between civil and ecclesiastical authorities, there was no distinction between religion and politics as we conceive it. This religious secular distinction, as we know it, was the creation of early modern struggles for power between ecclesiastical and civil authorities. In the creation of the modern sovereign state between the 15th and the 17th centuries, that's where this religious secular distinction comes from. Religion was invented as a universal, essentially interior and private impulse that's essentially separate from politics and other secular concerns. So henceforth, the church's proper area of concern would be essentially alien from politics. You can see the advantages of this arrangement to the rulers of modern states, right? Religion, that's what church people do. Politics is something different. That's what we do. The idea then that religion is a transcultural and transhistorical impulse makes this separation of religion and politics appear natural and inevitable, and not just a contingent power arrangement in one particular kind of society. We've come to think of this religious secular distinction, though, as universal. How did that come about? Well, it came about in the process of colonization. It was exported from Europe to the rest of the world. Suddenly, people in the rest of the world discovered that they had religions too that were separate from secular things. Smith's study concludes that, quote, there is no closely equivalent concept to religion in any culture that has not been influenced by the modern West. There was no such, end quote, there was no such concept in ancient Greece, Egypt, China, India, anywhere else in the ancient world. So in their initial encounters with the non-Western world, European explorers reported back home with remarkable consistency that the natives have no religion at all. I've got a long list of these in my book of explorers writing back from Australia or Africa and saying the natives have no religion at all. Once they were colonized, however, the category religion became a powerful tool in the classification of native cultures as essentially distinct from the business of government. Hinduism, to give one example. Hinduism is a term that's first used in the 1780s. You have Hindus before then, but you don't have Hinduism. Hinduism becomes a religion in the course of the 19th century under British colonization, despite the fact that it encompassed the entire Indian way of life, everything that we would divide into culture, politics, religion, art, economy, and so on. All of that is included in Hinduism, but it becomes a religion under British rule. Why? Fritz Stahl has concluded, quote, Hinduism does not merely fail to be a religion, it's not even a meaningful unit of discourse. That's not an insult to Hindus, right? What he means by that is that it's like talking about Americanism, right? What is Americanism? It encompasses so much of the life of a particular people that it's not, Fritz Stahl says it's not even a meaningful unit of discourse. It nevertheless becomes very useful. Why? Because under British rule, if Hinduism was a religion, then to be Indian was to be private and to be British was to be public. Right? If Hinduism is a religion, then to be Indian is to be private and to be British is to be public. And that is why many contemporary advocates of Hindu nationalism, the powerful BJP, the second largest party in India, they reject the classification of Hinduism as a religion. As Richard Cohen writes, the proponents of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, refuse to call Hinduism a religion precisely because they want to emphasize that Hinduism is more than mere internalized beliefs. It is social, political, economic, familial, in nature. For similar reasons, Chinese nationalists in the 19th century denied that Confucianism and Taoism were religions, and for similar reasons, even today, the Chinese government excludes Confucianism from the official list of religions in China because it's seen as expression of the national character, whereas religion is something which is private and otherworldly. And so in her book, The Invention of World Religions, Tomoko Masusawa concludes, quote, "This concept of religion as a general transcultural phenomenon, yet also as a distinct sphere in its own right, is patently groundless. It came from nowhere, and there is no credible way of demonstrating its factual and empirical substantiality." The only part of this quote I would take issue with is that it doesn't just come from nowhere. There are certain relations of power that make this happen. Colonialism, for one. So in other words, the religious-secular distinction is not engraved in the nature of things. It's a distinction that's employed in Western or Westernized societies to marginalize certain kinds of beliefs and practices and to authorize others. So last part of the talk, then, I'm going to talk about what practices get authorized and what practices don't. What's it for, in other words? If this conventional wisdom that religion causes violence is so incoherent, why is it so prevalent? I think it's because we in the West find it useful in both domestic and foreign policy. In domestic, so I'm going to talk about some domestic examples first and then some foreign policy examples. In domestic life in the United States, the myth of religious violence has played a key role in shifting the dominant mode of jurisprudence from what Frederick Geddix calls religious communitarianism to secular individualism. I went back and looked at the use of religion in every Supreme Court case from the beginning, every First Amendment Supreme Court case. And what I found was that until 1940, religion is invoked as a unifying reality in American life. And after 1940, it's invoked by the Supreme Court as a divisive influence in American society and something that needs, therefore, to be guarded against. The first U.S. Supreme Court decision to invoke the myth of religious violence was Minersville School District versus Gobaitis in 1940, which upheld compulsory pledging of allegiance to the American flag. Writing for the majority, Justice Felix Frankfurter invoked the specter of religious wars in denying the Jehovah's Witnesses the right to dissent from patriotic rituals. Quote, this is Justice Felix Frankfurter writing for the majority. "Centuries of strife over the erection of particular dogmas as exclusive or all-comprehending faiths led to the inclusion of a guarantee of religious freedom in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment sought to guard against those repetition of those bitter religious struggles by prohibiting the establishment of a state religion and by securing to every sect the free exercise of its faith." Right? Now you'd think that he would have ruled in favor of the Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't have to salute the American flag if they don't think that this is consistent with their religious beliefs. No. The Jehovah's Witnesses' dissent, Frankfurter goes on, threatens the promotion of national cohesion. We are dealing with an interest inferior to none in the hierarchy of legal values. National unity is the basis of national security. And he goes on to write what the school authorities, the ones insisting that everyone has to salute the American flag, are really asserting is the right to awaken in the child's mind considerations as to the significance of the flag contrary to those implanted by the parent. Something sort of chilling about that. Now the court would reverse itself 3 years later, but Frankfurter had succeeded in introducing the idea that First Amendment decisions could be made against a backdrop of some unspecified history of bitter religious struggles, the antidote to which is the enforcement of national unity. Now, Martin Marty discusses this case, Minersville versus Gobaitis, and he cites the many instances of Jehovah's Witnesses who were attacked, beaten, tarred, castrated, imprisoned in the United States in the 1940s because they believed that followers of Jesus Christ should not salute a flag. Here's an example from St. Louis paper of rioting against Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, one would think that Marty would draw the obvious conclusion that zealous nationalism can cause violence. Astonishingly, Marty concludes instead that it's religion that causes problems. It poses us versus them, carries risks, and can be perceived by others as dangerous. Religion can cause all kinds of trouble in the public arena. So for Marty, what religion means is not the ritual vowing of allegiance to a flag, but only to the Jehovah's Witnesses' refusal to do so. And so in this way, the myth of religious violence is used to draw attention away from nationalist violence and toward so-called religious violence, even though in this case, the Jehovah's Witnesses were the ones suffering the violence rather than perpetrating it. In the succeeding decades after Minersville versus Gobitis, the myth of religious violence would be invoked by the Supreme Court in case after case. So in the decisions banning school prayer, forbidding voluntary religious instruction on public school property, forbidding state aid to parochial school teachers, and so on and so on. When the court banned school prayer in the Abingdon case in 1963, again invoking the specter of religious violence, Justice Potter Stewart dissented, warning of, quote, the establishment of a religion of secularism. And Stewart noted the long history of government religious practice in the U.S., including the fact that the Supreme Court starts its sessions with God save this honorable court, right? In their concurring opinion, Justices Goldberg and Harlan responded to this critique of Potter Stewart. They addressed this objection by drawing a sharp line between patriotic invocations of God and religious invocations of God. So here's what they said. There is, of course, nothing in the decision reached here that is inconsistent with the fact that school children and others are officially encouraged to express love for our country by reciting historical documents which contain references to the deity, or by singing officially espoused anthems which include the composer's professions of faith in a supreme being, or with the fact that there are many manifestations in our public life of belief in God. Such patriotic or ceremonial occasions bear no true resemblance to the unquestioned religious exercise that the state has sponsored in this instance. Now, they don't give any reason why patriotic invocations of God bear no true resemblance to religious invocations. But it's clear that what separates religion from what's not religion is not the invocation of God. God may be invoked in public ceremonies without such ceremonies becoming religious exercises, provided that such ceremonies express love for our country. So separating religion from non-religion in this case depends not on the presence or absence of expressions of faith in God, but on the presence or absence of expressions of faith in the United States of America. So American nationalism, then, once again, is the antidote for religious divisiveness, and more specifically, revulsion to killing and dying in the name of one's religion is one of the principal means by which we become convinced that killing and dying in the name of America is laudable and proper, which brings me to foreign policy. The conventional wisdom in foreign policy helps reinforce and justify Western attitudes and policies toward the non-Western world, especially Muslims these days, whose primary point of difference with the West is said to be their stubborn refusal to tame religious passions in the public sphere. So Hitchens, for example, skewers religion for its violence, but he was an enthusiastic supporter of the Iraq War and of Western military adventures in the Muslim world. So despite his attempt to recruit Martin Luther King to his side, Hitchens has some very approving things to say about killing people. Quote, "And I say to the Christians while I'm at it, go love your own enemies. By the way, don't be loving mine. I think the enemies of civilization should be beaten and killed and defeated, and I don't make any apology for it." End quote. So for Hitchens, the Iraq War was part of a broader war for secularism, He has an article called Bush's War for Secularism. And the game is zero sum. Here's another quote from Hitchens. It is not possible for me to say, well, you pursue your Shiite dream of a hidden imam, and I pursue my study of Thomas Paine and George Orwell, and the world is big enough for both of us. The true believer cannot rest until the whole world bows the knee. Now, what Hitchens means by the true believer is the Islamist, but Hitchens' message is that the true believer in secularism can also not rest until the whole world has been converted to secularism by force if necessary. Let me give one more example. New atheist Sam Harris's book about violence and irrationality of religion it dramatically illustrates this double standard. The End of Faith is the name of the book. Harris condemns the irrational religious torture of witches in the beginning of the book, and towards the end he provides his own argument for torturing terrorists. His book is charged with the conviction that the secular West cannot reason with religious people, but must deal with them by force. Some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them. Certain beliefs place their adherents beyond the reach of every peaceable means of persuasion while inspiring them to commit acts of extraordinary violence against others. There is, in fact, no talking to some people. If they cannot be captured, and they often cannot, otherwise tolerant people may be justified in killing them in self-defense. This is what the United States attempted in Afghanistan, and is what we and other Western powers are bound to attempt at even greater cost to ourselves and innocents abroad, elsewhere in the Muslim world. We will continue to spill blood in what is, at bottom, a war of ideas. Now, his logic here is impeccable, right? If religious people hold irrational beliefs so fervently they will do violence for them, there's no use trying to reason with them. They can only be dealt with by force. And so the myth of religious violence becomes, in fact, a justification for the use of violence. In a chapter entitled The Problem with Islam, Harris writes, quote, "In our dialogue with the Muslim world, we are confronted by people who hold beliefs for which there is no rational justification, and which therefore cannot even be discussed. And yet these are the very beliefs that underlie many of the demands they are likely to make upon us." End quote. This is especially a problem, Harris says, if such people gain access to nuclear weapons. Quote, "There is little possibility of our having a Cold War with an Islamist regime armed with long-range nuclear weapons. In such a situation, the only thing likely to ensure our survival may be a nuclear first strike of our own. Needless to say, this would be an unthinkable crime, as it would kill tens of millions of innocent civilians in a single day. But it may be the only course of action available to us, given what Islamists believe." End quote. So Muslims, he goes on to say, would likely misinterpret this act of self-defense, a nuclear first strike, as a genocidal crusade, thus plunging the world into nuclear holocaust. Quote, "All of this is perfectly insane, of course. I have just described a plausible scenario in which much of the world's population could be annihilated on account of religious ideas that belong on the same shelf with Batman, the Philosopher's Stone, and unicorns." So in other words, if we have to slaughter millions of people through a nuclear first strike, it's their fault for their crazy religious beliefs. Before we get to that point, Harris continues, we must encourage civil society in Islamic countries, but we cannot trust them to vote it in. One more quote. "It seems all but certain that some form of benign dictatorship will generally be necessary to bridge the gap. But benignity is the key, and if it cannot emerge from within a state, it must be imposed from without. The means of such imposition are necessarily crude. They amount to economic isolation, military intervention, or some combination of both. While this may seem an exceedingly arrogant doctrine to espouse, I think it appears we have no alternatives." Now, to conclude then, Harris's book is a particularly blunt version of this type of justification, but he's by no means isolated. This book was a New York Times bestseller. It won the 2005 Penn Award for nonfiction. It is enthusiastically endorsed by such academic superstars as Alan Dershowitz, Richard Dawkins, and Peter Singer. This is Peter Singer, the same guy who thinks that it's unethical to kill irrational animals for food, but apparently killing irrational Muslims is a different thing. Harris's logic is little different in practice from the Bush doctrine that America has access to liberal values that are, quote, right and true for every person in every society, end quote, and we must use our power to promote such values on every continent, and America will take preemptive military action if necessary to promote such values. Those are all quotes from Bush's national security doctrine of 2002. Now, I don't wish either to deny the virtues of liberalism or excuse the vices of other kinds of social orders. That's not the point. What I'm trying to do is level the playing field so that we examine the violence that can be generated by the concept of jihad, for example. But we also examine the violence that can be generated by ideologies of free markets and free elections. So put simply, my argument is that people kill for all sorts of things. Things like money and flags and oil and freedom that function as gods in people's lives. There's where the idolatry theme comes in. I wish to challenge the religious-secular dichotomy that causes us to turn a blind eye to liberal forms of imperialism and violence, insofar as the myth of religious violence creates the villains against which a liberal social order defines itself. The myth is little different than previous forms of Western imperialism that established the inferiority of non-Western others and subjected them to Western power in the hopes of making them more like us. Right? That's what we're always trying to do, is make them more like us. If the argument is taken seriously, I think it would neither vilify Western-style liberalism nor justify theocracy, but rather help us to see that these are not the only two choices that there are. U.S. foreign policy could refrain on insisting that Muslims must either choose between Iran or Canada. Right? There are other possibilities out there. Violence feeds on the need for enemies, the need to separate us from them, and such binary ways of dividing the world make the world understandable for us but unlivable for many. So doing away with the myth of religious violence, I think, is one way of resisting such binaries and perhaps turning some enemies into friends. Thank you.
I might, if I take the liberty to ask the first question.
As long as it's an easy one.
It's maybe difficult for me to express. If we accept that religion is not a transhistorical category, we can't use it to look at all of history, it's a modern invention. Even if it is invented, our categories which are invented have effects.
Yeah.
Right? So they have like economic effects, legal effects. They come about within, for example, the legal sphere, but then they have legal effects, and they have social effects. Wouldn't it be, could one argue then that this category which does things could actually raise the stakes? And I don't want to say it's essentially more violent, but for example, I'm thinking of Robert, I don't know how he pronounces his last name, Pappy's work on suicide bombers. He looks at all, kind of does a statistical comparison and suggests that suicide bombing is more likely in conflicts where there's religious difference. And so that religion as a category, because it's not, it's a public category, right? We all use it. We'll think like, I'm this religion, I'm not that religion. But that difference, the category actually can raise the stakes and have social effects. And one could argue, I don't know if I'd argue this, then in this case, religion is actually, at least if not creating, but contributing to violence. That is, the category is doing.
Yeah, I mean, you could. I mean, of course, that all depends on how you. Sorry.
You could repeat the question back into the mic. I know
Well, I don't want to make you do that.
But just paraphrase it.
Did anybody not hear the question?
Just because we're filming.
Oh, okay, we're filming. Okay, great.
So does the discursive category of religion have its own effects on violence?
I guess that would be the question.
Does the discursive category of religion have its own effects on violence? Once you've created the category, is there a sense in which you can say that that there is sense talking about it now that we've got the
someone might say, because I'm doing this for religious purposes, and that raises the stakes for me, and therefore I'm going to do this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would never deny that people can say this is important to me, and this is why I'm doing it, because of my Muslim faith, because of my Christian faith, because of my Buddhist faith. I mean, clearly that happens, and I'm by no means trying to deny that. What I'm trying to do is level the playing field so that we look at those instances of violence, but we also look at the instances of violence that are caused by people who believe in things like freedom, right? Which tends to be what we kill for. The problem with the example of the suicide bomber is that we focus so much attention on bombs that are detonated in backpacks, and we tend to ignore the bombs that are dropped from airplanes, right? Because we're the ones dropping the bombs from airplanes, or in the case of drones, it doesn't even need to be manned, right? And so those kinds of bombings that escapes our attention. That just seems like surgical strikes. You got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Civilians are getting killed by drones, but we think that the technology is, yada, yada, yada. Those don't strike us as violence. That seems to be something that's in a whole different category than the kind of things that happens when somebody with a bomb in a backpack wades into a cafe in Jerusalem and blows people up. Both of them are reprehensible, and what I'm trying to do is kind of level the playing field so that we can examine both of those kinds of fanaticism. Call it fanatic. I mean, we tend to what we tend to call we tend to not use the term fanaticism and use the term patriotism instead.
Yeah,
just to say something along.
I guess it's my question has it's just the issue of how people take up, because this myth, right? Somebody could actually embody it themselves. They could understand religion as violent, and therefore, since I am now religious, right? Like the myth of religious violence can actually be embodied by people, right? It's a discursive category of religion. It can be taken up. People think of themselves in this way. So I guess but that doesn't actually challenge your argument, because your argument is actually about the essential violence or not.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I gave a talk on this to PhD students at Berkeley last year, and one of the students asked me, what do we do with the term religion then? And my first reaction was, I prefer not to use that term as much as possible, just because of all the confusion it creates. But I realized that was the wrong response, because so we went out to dinner then with these doctoral students, and they told me the history of what they've been through trying to get Berkeley to take religion seriously in the political science department at a very secular university. They've worked very hard to get them to take religion seriously, and here I come saying, oh, let's not talk about it. And so I realized that my response was wrong. Let's do talk about it, but let's talk about it as here we've been talking about religion as if religion is this, right? But what religion really is this. It's the lens through which we see things that are out there. And that's precisely the kind of thing that we need to be talking about. How is this category constructed? It's real. It's not, the argument is not there's no such thing as religion. There is such a thing as religion. It's just a constructed category, and we need to be self-aware of how the category is constructed. I had another guy come up to me. He was in the religious studies department at the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's university. And he said, would you knock it up? You're going to put me out of a job, if people take this idea of kind of deconstructing religion seriously. But that's not the point, right? The point isn't to say there's no such thing, and that, Timothy Fitzgerald will argue that religious studies departments ought to be disbanded into anthropology and sociology and so on. And I just think that's wrong. right? I mean, for one thing, because religious studies departments let theology get a foot in the door. It's surreptitiously theology goes on in the University of Virginia religious studies department, Thomas Jefferson's university, and I think that's a good subversive sort of thing. So.
Yeah, I had a similar experience reading McCutcheon in the '90s. I thought, oh yeah, religious studies, it reifies things. But actually, then you start teaching on religion, and you realize that the institution's not going to support the study of religion unless you say there's something there at least to study.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Frank Felix, Executive Director of World Faith, and we're an organization that's actually focused on ending religious-based violence in conflict zones in 15 countries, including some of the hotspots like Nigeria, Lebanon, Pakistan, India. So for me, it's really interesting kind of hearing this because on one hand, I get there's the academic sense versus the practical sense. In the practical sense, it's very easy for us to say what religious violence is, using religion as a platform of identity, without talking about theology. Just these people identify as this, those people identify as that, and they're killing each other. That's a pretty simple formula.
Yeah.
What I'm interested to know is approaching it from this academic lens. Those of us who are working in these contexts are very hungry for models of understanding religious violence, if we use this term, in a way that can be both prescriptive and descriptive to try to end it, right?
Yeah.
And so in that space, I'm wondering, is it possible, or in your own work, have you seen an attempt to maybe start with looking at the study on conflict itself? There's a lot of great research on what conflict is and how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And then saying, okay, how does this very understandable sort of concept of conflict translate into the religious context in a practical sense? Is that something that you've explored? Have you seen that done?
Well, here's what I would like to see happen on the practical level. I mean, this sounds like what I'm doing is, splitting hairs, right? Looking at the genealogy of the term religion and parsing it out in this way that it didn't used to be that way and now it is, and so on. So what, right? Is the possible response? Here's what I think are the practical effects. Once you start talking about violence as in a religious context, then you've automatically blinkered out so-called secular violence. And this is an eminently practical thing. We think that our violence is of a completely distinct order from the kind of violence that people do in the name of God. And I just think that creates all kinds of havoc. That's what's behind the Iraq War, I think, frankly, is we've got to bomb them into the higher rationality. So, I mean, these kinds of arguments, I think, have incredibly practical effects. What I would urge people to do who are studying so-called religious violence is, instead of studying religious violence, you study violence in a Christian context or in a Muslim context, and as specific as you can get, the closer you get to something that's not going to be distorting, right? So you look at Wahhabism, for example, and look at this particular instance of Islam, and look at the ways that violence might be generated by the certain kinds of readings of certain texts and the kinds of educational institutions that Wahhabists support in various places. The more you can avoid using the term religion, the closer you are to getting something accurate and useful and worthwhile. The closer you get, the more you can avoid using the term Islam, as in Islam does this or Islam believes that, the closer you can get to something that's actually going to be useful and not ideological, not distorting in that way. I mean, John Esposito, one of the great scholars of Islam, says even talking about Islam as a religion already distorts it, because it already marks Islam as an abnormal religion because they don't separate religion from politics. And so even putting Islam under the category of religion is already doing a certain sort of violence to them there. So the more that your center can encourage studies of particular empirical instances of how violence is generated in very particular and local contexts, the more useful I think it becomes.
Further questions?
Thank you for your lecture. I've followed you for a couple of years. I do have a question, since you just adequately proved that secularism is a religion. My question for you is it a heresy?
Is secularism a heresy?
Yeah.
Goodness, it depends what you mean by secularism, I suppose. I mean, I think...
Secularism not defined by St. Augustine, or religion, or secularism not defined by the medievals, as you said, divided between secular and Catholic work. Secularism is defined by the modern state as
Yeah.
to religion.
If what you mean by secularism is the separation of church and state, I think that's a good thing. And I can give you Christian theological reasons why Christians should support the separation of church from the coercive means of violence. I think to be a disciple of the Prince of Peace means to put down your access to coercive means. So if that's what you mean by secularism, then no, it's not a heresy. If what you mean by secularism is that there are large swaths of life on earth to which God is indifferent and irrelevant, then yeah, it's a heresy from a Christian point of view.
Any further questions? I think actually that's a perfect closing line. That was a bold statement. I think that's a perfect place to end. It was great. Join me in thanking Professor Cavanaugh.